June 6, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. The phone rang in the operations room of the German Armed Forces High Command. The duty officer listened, his face draining of color as the report came through from Normandy. Allied paratroopers were dropping behind the beaches. Naval bombardment had begun. An invasion fleet, larger than anything in human history, was approaching the French coast. The officer looked at the clock. He looked at the phone. He did not make the call he should have made, because Adolf Hitler was sleeping, and nobody wanted to be the one to wake him with bad news. This moment, this hesitation, this fear of disturbing the Führer's rest, would shape everything that followed. Because the Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable fortress that stretched from Norway to Spain, was breaking. And the man who had ordered its construction, who had declared it would make invasion impossible, who had staked Germany's entire defensive strategy on its strength, was asleep. And when he finally woke, what he said, what he believed, and what he refused to believe would determine whether Germany could throw the Allies back into the sea, or whether the Third Reich had just hours left to stop its own destruction. But to understand Hitler's reaction, you first have to understand what he thought he had built. The Atlantic Wall existed in two versions. There was the propaganda version, the one shown in newsreels and photographs, the one that lived in Hitler's imagination. Massive concrete bunkers bristling with artillery, endless rows of beach obstacles, minefields stretching for kilometers, crack troops manning every position, ready to slaughter any invasion force before it reached the sand. Hitler had declared it impregnable. Goebbels had called it the greatest fortification in history. The German people had been told that the wall made invasion impossible. Then there was the real Atlantic Wall, and the real version was very different. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had arrived in France in late 1943 to inspect the coastal defenses. What he found horrified him. Yes, there were bunkers, but huge stretches of coast had nothing at all. The bunkers that existed were often incomplete, poorly positioned, or built to face the wrong direction. Beach obstacles were sparse, minefields were patchy, and the troops manning these positions were, in many cases, men who Germany didn't want anywhere near the Eastern Front. Older men, boys, conscripts from occupied territories who had no desire to die for Germany. Men with stomach ailments who'd been formed into special stomach battalions because they needed special diets. Rommel had worked frantically for months to improve the defenses. He'd added millions of beach obstacles, mines, and underwater barriers. He'd improved fields of fire and brought up more artillery, but he knew the truth. The Atlantic Wall was a shell, impressive in places, but with fatal gaps, and he knew something else. If the Allies established a beachhead, if they got ashore and stayed ashore, Germany would lose the war. The only chance was to destroy them on the beaches in the first hours, before they could bring their overwhelming material superiority to bear. Rommel had begged Hitler for one thing: control of the Panzer divisions, the tank reserves that could race to the coast and crush an invasion. Rommel wanted them positioned close to the likely landing sites, ready to counterattack immediately. But Hitler had refused. He insisted on keeping personal control of the armored reserves. They could not move without his direct authorization. This meant that when the invasion came, when every minute counted, when speed was everything, the panzers would sit idle, waiting for permission from a man who might be asleep, or having lunch, or watching a movie. On the night of June 5th, Rommel wasn't even in France. The weather had been terrible, storms lashing the Channel. Every meteorologist agreed that invasion was impossible in such conditions. Rommel had gone home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to plead with Hitler one more time for more resources. He was planning to continue on to meet with Hitler at the Berghof. So when the Allied Armada came through the darkness, when 12,000 aircraft filled the sky, when 150,000 men prepared to storm the beaches, the Atlantic Wall's inspector was in Germany, and its supreme commander was asleep. The reports started arriving at German headquarters around 4 in the morning, paratroopers dropping inland, naval gunfire, radio intercepts suggesting something massive was underway. But the officers on duty faced a dilemma. Hitler had been up late, as he often was. He rarely went to bed before 3 or 4 in the morning, and he hated being woken. His rages were legendary. Officers who disturbed his sleep with false alarms could find themselves dismissed, or worse. So they waited. They told themselves it might be a raid, a feint, a diversion. Surely if it was the real invasion, it would be obvious. Surely they would know. The minutes ticked by. 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5:30. The sun rose over Normandy, revealing a sight that no German had imagined possible. The horizon was filled with ships, thousands of ships, a fleet so vast it seemed to cover the entire channel. And still, Hitler slept. He was finally informed sometime between 9 and 10 in the morning. The accounts vary on the exact time and who told him. What they agree on is his reaction. He was not alarmed. He was not panicked. He was, if anything, pleased. "So they have come," he said. He smiled. Because Adolf Hitler believed he knew something the Allies didn't. He believed he knew where the real invasion was coming. This was not it. Hitler had convinced himself with absolute certainty that the main Allied invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, the shortest route to Germany, the most logical place to land. Every piece of intelligence seemed to confirm it. Allied bombing had been heaviest around Calais. Radio intercepts suggested a massive army group positioned in southeast England, directly across from Calais, under the command of General George Patton. What Hitler didn't know was that almost all of this intelligence was fake. Operation Fortitude, one of the most successful deceptions in military history, had created an entirely phantom army. Dummy tanks and landing craft filled British fields. False radio traffic filled the airwaves. Double agents fed German intelligence exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. And Hitler, who prided himself on his intuition, who trusted his gut over his generals, had swallowed it completely. So when news came of landings in Normandy, Hitler's reaction was not fear. It was vindication. This was the diversion he'd been expecting. The Allies were trying to draw German forces away from Calais, where the real blow would fall. It was clever, he thought, but not clever enough. He would not fall for it. The officers around him tried to explain the scale of what was happening, the number of ships, the intensity of the bombardment, the reports of multiple landing beaches. Surely this was too large to be a feint. Hitler waved them off. "This is not the invasion," he said. The real invasion was still coming, at Calais. He was sure of it, and because he was sure, he refused to release the Panzer reserves. The 12th SS Panzer Division was positioned southeast of Caen, within striking distance of the British landing beaches. Panzer Lehr, one of Germany's best armored divisions, was near Chartres. These divisions could have reached the coast by afternoon. They could have hit the Allies while they were still vulnerable, still organizing on the beaches, still bringing up heavy weapons. Rommel had planned for exactly this. Strike hard, strike fast, drive them back into the sea before they could consolidate. But the panzers needed Hitler's authorization to move. And Hitler said no, they were to stay in position, ready for the real invasion at Calais. Hour after hour passed. The Allies poured ashore, the beachheads expanded. By afternoon, thousands of vehicles were landing. Artillery was being positioned. The initial German counterattacks, launched by the units actually stationed near the beaches, were too weak, too poorly coordinated. They were thrown back. General Jodl, chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff, tried again to convince Hitler. The reports from Normandy were overwhelming. This had to be the main invasion. Hitler needed to release the panzers now, while there was still time. Hitler's response was sharp. "We cannot commit our reserves based on panic. This is exactly what they want. We hold fast. We wait for Calais. But there was something else in his voice now. Not quite doubt, but something harder. An edge of anger, because even as he insisted Normandy was a diversion, even as he held to his certainty, some part of him was beginning to realize that his generals might be right. And if they were right, if he had guessed wrong, if his intuition had failed him, then he had just made a catastrophic mistake. By evening of June 6th, the Allies had landed over 150,000 men. They held all 5 beaches. The Atlantic Wall, the impregnable fortress, had been broken in a single day, and Hitler's Panzer reserves, the force that might have destroyed the invasion, sat idle, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. Rommel, racing back from Germany, arrived at his headquarters after midnight. He was shown the reports. His face, witnesses said, went grey. "It's too late," he said quietly. "If they're ashore, if they've had a day to dig in, we've lost." He knew what Hitler had not yet accepted. The battle for the beaches was over. The Allies had won it. Now it would be a battle of attrition, of material, of supply, and Germany could not win that battle. But Hitler still believed he could throw them back. On June 7th, he finally authorized the panzers to move. But now they had to move in daylight, under clear skies, and the Allies owned the skies. Allied fighter bombers swarmed over every road leading to Normandy. The panzer divisions were savaged before they even reached the front. Tanks burned in columns. Supply trucks exploded. What should have been a 4-hour drive took 2 days, and the divisions arrived piecemeal, exhausted and depleted. Hitler's response was fury. Not at himself, not at his decision to wait. At his generals, at the troops, at the Luftwaffe for not protecting the roads, at everyone except the man who had made the decision that mattered. In the military conferences over the following days, his rage grew. He demanded counterattacks, immediate counterattacks, drive them back into the sea. The Atlantic Wall might be broken, but they were still contained. They hadn't broken out. There was still time. His generals tried to explain reality. The Allies were landing thousands of tons of supplies every day. They had absolute air superiority. German units were being ground down. Every counterattack was being smashed by naval gunfire and airstrikes. They needed to pull back, form a coherent defensive line, conserve forces. Hitler's response was always the same. No retreat, hold every meter, counterattack. And then, increasingly, if we're failing, it's because my orders aren't being followed. It's because of defeatism. It's because of cowardice. But privately, in moments when his guard was down, different words emerged. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, visited him in mid-June. He found Hitler looking older, more tired. They talked about the situation in France, and Hitler said something that Speer never forgot. The war is lost. Speer was stunned. He'd never heard Hitler admit such a thing. He asked what Hitler meant. If they're in France, if they can supply an army in France, we cannot win. We don't have the fuel. We don't have the reserves. We can fight. We can make them pay, but we cannot win. But then, almost immediately, Hitler's mood shifted. No, he said. There were still the secret weapons. The V-weapons that would devastate London. The jet fighters that would sweep the skies. New U-boats that would cut the Atlantic supply lines. They just needed time. They needed to hold on. The alliance between the Soviets and the Western Allies would crack. It had to crack. Such unnatural allies couldn't stay together. Germany just had to survive long enough. This became Hitler's pattern in the weeks after D-Day. Oscillation between grim realism and desperate fantasy. Between admitting the situation was hopeless and insisting that miracle weapons or political collapse would save Germany. Between rage at his generals and rare moments of recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, he had made errors. The city of Cherbourg fell on June 26th and 27th. It was a major port, and Hitler had ordered it held to the last man. The garrison surrendered after the Americans surrounded it. When Hitler heard, he flew into one of his worst rages. He screamed about cowardice, about betrayal. He demanded courts-martial. He insisted that the commander should have fought to the death. But Cherbourg's fall meant the Allies could bring in supplies through a real port, not just over the beaches. It meant the beachhead was permanent. It meant there would be no throwing them back into the sea. On June 29th, Hitler met with his senior commanders in France. Rommel and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander in the West, came to the Berghof. They had come to tell Hitler the truth, plainly and directly. The situation in Normandy was unsustainable. German forces were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The Allies were building up strength for a breakout. When that came, there was no reserve to stop it. Germany needed to seek a political solution, an armistice in the West, so forces could be shifted east to stop the Soviets. Hitler listened to them in cold silence. When they finished, he spoke. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than his rages. "You want me to make peace with the British and Americans? After everything, after all we've done?" He shook his head. "There will be no peace. There will be no surrender. We fight until we win or until we are destroyed. Those are the only options." Rommel tried again. "Mein Führer, the military situation, I don't want to hear about the military situation." Hitler's voice rose. "I want to hear about victory. I want to hear about counterattacks. I want to hear about throwing them back. The Atlantic Wall was broken because my orders weren't followed, because there was defeatism, because the Atlantic Wall was broken because it was never what you believed it was," Rommel said. The room went silent. No one spoke to Hitler like that. "It was broken because we didn't have the troops, the weapons, or the air cover to hold it. It was broken because the Allies are stronger than us. These are facts." Hitler stared at him. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, acceptance. But then it was gone, replaced by cold fury. "Get out," he said quietly. "Both of you, get out." They left. Rundstedt would be relieved of command within days. Rommel would be implicated in the July 20th bomb plot and forced to commit suicide. Hitler would tolerate no more truth-tellers. But alone, in the days that followed, Hitler's mood darkened further. His secretary, Traudl Junge, remembered him pacing at night, talking to himself. She heard fragments. Should have released them earlier. But Calais, they fooled me. No, the generals failed. He could not admit even to himself that his certainty about Calais had been wrong, that his intuition, which he trusted above all intelligence, had failed him, that the decision to hold the Panzers back, his decision, had cost Germany its last chance to stop the invasion. To admit that would be to admit that he was fallible, that his judgment could be wrong. And if his judgment could be wrong about Normandy, it could be wrong about everything. So instead, he blamed others. The generals who hadn't fought hard enough, the troops who hadn't held, the Luftwaffe that hadn't provided air cover, the Atlantic Wall that hadn't been strong enough. Everyone except the man who had made the decisions that mattered. By July, the Allies were preparing their breakout. Operation Cobra would shatter the German lines and send American armor racing across France. Hitler still demanded that every meter be held, still insisted on counterattacks, still believed that willpower could overcome material reality. On July 20th, a bomb exploded at his headquarters in East Prussia. The assassination attempt by his own officers failed, but it confirmed what Hitler had been thinking. He was surrounded by traitors, by defeatists, by men who didn't believe in victory. That was why Germany was losing. Not because of his decisions, because of their lack of faith. In August, he ordered a massive counterattack at Mortain, trying to cut off the American breakout. He committed his last reserves in France. The attack was crushed in 2 days, and the forces he committed were encircled and destroyed in the Falaise Pocket. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The army in France was shattered. When the reports reached him, Hitler's only response was to order that the officers who had failed to hold Mortain be court-martialed. He did not mention that he had ordered the attack, that he had insisted on it over all objections, that he had committed forces that should have been used to retreat in good order. Paris fell on August 25th. Hitler had ordered it defended to the last, building burned if necessary. The commander surrendered it intact. Hitler raged about betrayal, but Paris was lost, and with it, all of France would soon follow. In September, the Allies reached the German border. The Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to keep them from even landing, was 1,000 kilometers behind them, and Hitler, in his bunker, surrounded by maps showing disaster on every front, still could not bring himself to say the words that mattered. I was wrong, because to say that would be to admit that the entire disaster stemmed from one morning in June. One decision, one refusal to release the Panzers, because he was certain, absolutely certain, that Normandy was a diversion, that Calais was coming, that his intuition was infallible. Instead, he said other things, that Germany had been betrayed, that the soldiers had not fought hard enough, that the generals had been defeatist, that if only his orders had been followed, if only there had been more faith, more will, more sacrifice, victory would have been possible. But late at night, alone, the words he'd said to Speer came back. The war is lost. He'd known it in June, known it when the reports from Normandy kept coming, known it when the Panzers finally moved and arrived too late, known it when Cherbourg fell, known it when Rommel told him the truth. He'd known it, but he could never say it, could never admit it, could never accept that the moment the Atlantic Wall broke, the moment the Allies came ashore and stayed ashore, the moment he'd held back the Panzers because he was so certain he knew better than everyone else, that was the moment Nazi Germany's fate was sealed. The Atlantic Wall broke on June 6, 1944. But what Hitler said when he realized it, what he truly said in the privacy of his own thoughts, was nothing. Because to realize it, to truly realize it, would be to realize that he had destroyed everything himself. And that was a realization Adolf Hitler could never, would never allow himself to have. Instead, he blamed everyone else, and he dragged Germany down with him into the abyss, rather than admit that his certainty, his intuition, his infallible judgment had been wrong. The Atlantic Wall broke in a day, but Hitler's ability to face reality had broken long before that. And in the end, that was the real catastrophe. Not that the wall fell, but that the man who'd built it could never admit it had been built on sand.